Sony seems to be going ham on putting their camera tech in small bodies. The ZV lineup has reached a high point with the ZV-E1, the compact camera lineup has been supported by multiple releases this year, and the a6700 recently brought back attention to that APS-C lineup. And they aren't holding back, providing two new versions that target miniaturizing their larger cameras in smaller, let's say, travel-friendly bodies. Honestly, I think I may have found my new go-to travel hybrid camera. It's Joshua Vergara. What's going on, everybody? Here it is, the Sony a7C II. That's right, this is a new a7C, bringing this lineup to Mark II. Now, I have to mention off the bat that Sony actually sent me this camera while I was in Korea recently, so I've had a little less time with it than other reviewers. Because of that, I'm going to talk about just the aspects of this camera that do get me excited, while giving a bit of perspective on why I think this is particularly suited to my needs. I also need to mention that this is technically the lesser of the two new a7C models. I say that mainly because of the differing price points. There is also going to be the a7C-R, which has a lot of the same features and a similar body to this a7C II, but that one comes with the massive 61 megapixel sensor that we saw in the premium a7R5. Yeah, I know that's a lot of acronyms, as Sony's naming conventions are basically an exercise in practicing the alphabet. Basically speaking, the a7C-R is meant to be like a baby a7R5, while this a7C II miniaturizes the camera that convinced me to go in on Sony more, the a7 IV. That would be the camera that you're seeing shoot my corner shot right now. Anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at this a7C II and start with the design. They're kind of the masters of this particular design by now, given their experience with the a6000 cameras and the interchangeable lens systems in the ZV line. But it was the original a7C that made it clear full-frame camera capabilities don't have to be put in huge bodies all the time. I have this two-tone edition, and I really appreciate the look of this as it gives it a bit of a nostalgia trip, and it's certainly the version I'm going to be gunning for if I decide to get my own a7C II. But what really gets me about the a7C II in comparison to something like the ZV-E1 are the various classic camera amenities, and yes, that includes an EVF. While the fully articulating screen is obviously a must, this OLED, that's right, OLED EVF is just great to have in a bright environment to minimize glare, and it's just easier for someone like me that does a lot of shooting off handheld devices. Frankly speaking, this just feels way better than this. The other thing that feels a lot better, the grip. Sony made a point of designing a substantial, comfortable, but still svelte grip, and it definitely feels that way. Despite the small size of the body, I haven't had any issues just keeping a grip on the camera one-handed without any fears of slippage. The textured material on and in the grip certainly help with that. There are also more dials on here than on the ZV-E1, which is a tactility that I certainly missed in that more vlogging-centric camera. And that kind of makes sense, as the ZV-E1 does appeal more to the video content creator that just might want to go full auto. Instead, the a7C II leans a bit more into the photography side of things. There are three dials here that govern the shutter speed, which is this one here, the aperture, which is up front, and then the exposure compensation, which is the big wheel up here. I've actually been finding myself using the EV slider more and more recently as I set the ISO to auto sometimes. Even I want a bit of a set it and forget it experience sometimes too. The dial to switch between photo, video, and S&Q modes is built right into the mode selection dial, and really everything feels pretty easily within reach, even if understandably a tiny bit cramped. Now, if there's one thing that I do wish this body had, it's just more customizable buttons. It's not a huge deal, and to be fair, there are a couple of buttons on the back, one near the menu button and this reprogrammable delete button. I just understand that having more custom buttons like this makes more sense on a larger body like I'm used to. The trade-off does make sense, and I'm willing to make that trade-off for such a small yet powerful body. And of course, the touchscreen can always house any of those extra functions. Along the left side are all of the ports, including a USB-C port for PD fast charging, for connecting to storage, and for USB streaming. There is a mic jack, a headphone jack, and a mini HDMI port. Like most people, I would have liked a full-sized HDMI port, but where do we have the room for that? And by the way, I always hear camera content creators talk about how mini HDMI ports are more prone to breaking. I certainly can see how that can be the case, but in my experience, I've actually never broken one myself. Still, I would have appreciated a larger HDMI. And if you've ever broken an HDMI port or a mini HDMI port, let me know in the comments. And finally, there is the single SD card slot and the Z battery found under the grip. But now that we've gotten a good look at the camera, why don't we go ahead and get shooting? This will also give me a chance to share what my usual setup is for on the go. Just to give you all an idea of what I'm shooting with here, I'm actually using the Sigma 16-28. It is an ultra-wide zoom lens, and it does allow for some really good vlogging shots like this, and I'm just holding the lens right now in order to get this shot. The other lens that I use is a little bit farther off. It's a 50mm lens, but it's also a macro at 2.8 aperture. I really like this setup because with the 50mm, even though it is a macro lens, it actually does a pretty good job as a portrait lens. And because this particular camera does APS-C shooting, giving it a bit of a crop, that effectively becomes like a 75mm. So it does pull a couple of double duties. So as a hybrid camera, the a7C II sports plenty of features for both photographers and videographers. The 33-megapixel sensor on here is actually backed up by the same AI image processing chip that has been popping up in more recent premium Sony cameras. That means even better subject detection for everything from people to birds to even trains. Perhaps Japan's obsession with the Shinkansen is on full display here, and it is warranted. Now on the video side of things, that AI processor does help elevate the autofocusing capabilities, which were already considered best in class, but it also enables the auto-framing video feature that you may have seen a lot from the ZV-E1. Now honestly, I'm not as experienced in judging photo image quality as many of the other people you might be seeing review this camera today, so why don't I just give a shout out and some gratitude to fellow creators like the guys at Petapixel, Gerald Undone, Terry Warfield, and Atola Visuals. They will all have plenty to say about both the photo and video capabilities here, so why don't you go ahead and watch those videos after you're done with mine. I definitely will be. Honestly, I'm sure the pictures coming out of here will be pretty great, providing the same Sony quality, but in a travel-friendly camera body that a lot of people have been waiting to come back. And when it comes to shooting photos, I have to give it up to the a7C II compared to the ZV-E1 for the EVF and this one very specific difference. Really, when it comes to shooting photos on the a7C II, there's one main thing that I'm really happy to see come back. Not just the EVF, but also an actual mechanical shutter. Sometimes you just need that click. On the video side of things, what we're looking at here is basically an updated AI-enabled A7 IV, and that's a really good thing. That means better autofocus because of the processing, updated image quality, and more options like S-Cinetone. In my case, I am using S-Cinetone right now. I usually dial in the colors and the settings in camera, so I have less work to do in post. So for this one, and I think it's picture profile 11, I have S-Cinetone on with saturation and I think contrast and a couple of other settings bumped up so I can get the look that I want while maintaining the good skin tones that S-Cinetone provides. A few other things I want to mention are the 7K oversampling that would help further the detail in videos. There are other features here as well, like of course clear image zoom if you want to get even more range, and then something that we've used a lot in the ZV-E1, the aspect marker that shows us 9:16 recording in a frame. That way, when you're doing your long form videos, you know how to cut out or where to cut out your center frame for vertical video. Now I'm about to get into the video stabilization on the a7C II in the vlogging section, but I do want to mention real quick before I get into it that I was in a run and gun situation, so you do get a bit of a look at what just going fully handheld with this camera looks like, but at the same time I was learning still a couple of things about the stabilization at that time. I will get more information on this and probably do a follow-up video on this camera in the future, but let me just say this. It is a net positive that I think that the stabilization on here is better than previous Sony bodies that I have used, and it doesn't really do much of a crop in order to achieve that. Okay, I want to talk about the stabilization a little bit more because honestly, that might be my favorite new development when it comes to the a7C II. See, stabilization on the other Sony cameras has always been not really my favorite. While it does a good enough job and I have pretty steady hands, it always seemed like the roll was what was not really fully stabilized on there. Now on the a7C II, without something like the dynamic active mode that was introduced in the ZV-E1, it seems like the stabilization on here is actually pretty dang solid. I'm walking right now and I'm just sort of vlogging your typical way with a wide angle lens, to be fair, but at the same time, I'm just like holding my arm out and looks like the footage is actually pretty dang stable. See, this is something that I have been waiting for on Sony cameras, and it's interesting that it's actually happening on the smaller compact body cameras. On the ZV-E1, sure, it was easy to get really stable footage using dynamic active, but that was at the cost of a very significant crop. And even if you wanted to get a little bit more length in your lenses in order to have more dramatic footage while having stabilization, that also meant that to get the best stable footage when doing shots like this, you would have to crop into even a wide angle 16mm like what I'm using right now. Compared to the ZV-E1, this does have that APS-C shooting. The ZV-E1 didn't really have that mode, mainly because it provided 4K video at 120 frames per second. While I would like to do some super slow-mo sometimes, I actually don't find myself using 120 frames per second all that much. On here, I'm happy to have the APS-C shooting, the actual official type, rather than having to rely on the dynamic active in order to get a proper crop with good stabilization. On the a7C II, I have good stabilization without having to crop in much at all. And when I want to get more of a crop to get a little bit more range, or get a little bit more length rather, that's when I just turn on APS-C Super 35 shooting. I think this combination of features is way more practical for me as opposed to having to deal with the crop of dynamic active on the ZV-E1 just so I can have 4K at 120 frames. Okay, I have to level with y'all. After reviewing the footage here on the camera, just after doing those walk and talk vloggy bits, I will admit there is still a little bit of shake there, but when it comes to stabilization, I'm mainly talking about those B-roll shots that you might have been seeing in this segment. It's still more stable than I remember other cameras from Sony being, like the a7 IV, which is, like I said before, the camera that actually got me into Sony systems. So I still have to give this camera, even though it's a smaller body, a lot of credit for providing really good stabilization given what you're getting in this kit. And you know what, honestly, if you are going to end up like vlogging on the go or just doing some walk and talk stuff, here's my number one tip. If you're worried about your stabilized footage, maybe stop moving. Stay in one spot and just hold the camera there. The stabilization will be perfectly fine for that particular scenario. So don't be afraid to just stay in one place once in a while. So obviously my perspective on this camera is a very high level one, but I've never really gotten too into the nitty gritty anyway with cameras, at least not yet. For now, I'm just reveling in the fact that the a7C II has come at just the right time for some of the needs I have realized I needed addressed. You see, recently I went on a 2-week trip to Korea and filmed some hybrid tech review travel content. I brought with me the Panasonic S5 II, which is one of my favorite cameras. It has great stabilization with very little cropping needed, has wonderful colors that I dialed in body, and honestly, it's been my main companion in 2023 so far. But it's a large camera, and I definitely felt it running around places like Busan in South Korea. And then this camera comes along, sporting most of the features that I use in the Lumix body, but in a smaller design. It certainly supports one of my favorite minimal audio recording solutions, this right here, the ECM B10 shotgun mic that connects through the hot shoe without any cables. For the level of content that I was shooting in Korea, which is a hybrid of tech, travel, and vlogging, I mean, look at this. This right here, this kit might just be the sweet spot for somebody like me. And that makes me believe that the a7C II just might be the best compact hybrid full-frame camera available right now. Compared to the ZV-E1, I mentioned a couple of reasons why the a7C II just makes a little bit more sense to me. The EVF is really appreciated, the stabilization is pretty good without needing too much cropping, there are more controls so that tactility is there, and for times when I really want to snap photos, the click is just way more satisfying on here. And while it's true that the dynamic active crop on the ZV-E1 kind of emulates an APS-C crop, it's one that you have to have on as often as possible just to get smooth vlogging footage, and that cuts into the wide-angle view of that classic vlogging style like I just showed off in the a7C II. And on this camera, it's less of an issue given the capable stabilization. It's just that the combination of features and capabilities that the a7C II have speak a little bit more to me as a video leaning, but sometimes photo taking shooter. My only regret is that I had such little time with this camera, but that might be likely to change soon as the camera is now available to order, and I'm actually probably at Sony's Kando event right now as you're watching this video, where I should be able to spend more time with this and the a7CR with that 61 megapixel sensor. Now at the time of making this video, I didn't have final pricing information, but I was told that it would be around the $2,000 mark. I'm willing to bet it'll be just about the same price as the Sony ZV-E1, making this the hybrid camera sibling to that video-centric shooter. And honestly, for those prices, these compact camera bodies are pretty damn compelling if you're looking for great content creation tools on the go. And so there you have it. I've had about a week with this camera, and yes, I did record a couple of my actual core content videos on this channel using the a7C II, so there are plenty of examples of what kind of quality you can expect out of this. But in any case, let me know your thoughts on the Sony a7C II in the comments. Thanks for indulging me as I give you my version of the, let's say, high-level thoughts on this camera. I'm still fairly new to the content camera game, but I appreciate you letting me branch out a little bit to talk about tools that I use almost as much as any mobile tech. For now, though, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Please take care of yourselves and each other, and enjoy your tea, everybody.